What's up, everybody? This is Jaron with REtipster.com, and I am super excited to talk to a former master miner, if that's a word, Lucas Hall, from over at Landlordology and Cozy.co. This guy is super smart. I'm really excited to dive into his particular strategy of house hacking specifically, because he's pretty much the only guy that I know who house hacks through roommates, or through having people rent out rooms and not having to mess with anything more than just a single family house. So Lucas, welcome, man. I'm super excited to have you here.
Hey, Jaron, it's great to see you again. I see you a lot actually in our mastermind, so but it's great to finally do this podcast with you. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, man. So let's just, for those that don't know, who are you? Just give like the 30-second synopsis of what Planet Lucas Hall is.
Planet Lucas Hall. Well, Planet Lucas Hall, I am the founder of landlordology.com, which is a premier educational website for landlords. So it teaches you how to be a better landlord or how to get started. And then I'm also head of industry relations at Cozy, which makes online property management software for independent landlords, and it's completely free. So you can manage everything about your properties without having to pay a dime. And I use it myself for the 5 properties that I manage from 2,000 miles away, and it works fantastic.
And he can't really say this because it would not sound authentic coming from him, but it's probably the best software out there for what it does. I mean, if I ever get back into being a mom and pop landlord myself, it's definitely the CRM software that I'm going to be using. So definitely check it out. You can't beat free. I mean, you just can't. So So the reason why I wanted to bring you on and pick your brain is I'm personally looking at the possibility of house hacking, and I want to explore my options. And I thought, hey, if I'm in that situation, there's probably several people within our community that are also in that situation. So I wanted to ask you, like, I know your background, you got started kind of not subleasing, but being the owner, but having tenants per room and kind of having a roommate situation. So can you dive into like maybe your first deal and all that?
Yeah, of course. And I think it's good to preface this with house hacking is a fantastic tool to like minimize your expenses. But I think that the type of house hacking that you do, which we'll explore one aspect of that, the type you do is really dependent on your situation in life. And so the type of house hacking that I'm about to explain, I wouldn't be able to do now because I have a wife and 2 dogs and a 6-year-old daughter, and that wouldn't fly if I had like a bunch of other roommates living in my house. So what I did first was I originally bought a 6-bedroom house on Capitol Hill in Washington, D.C. And I did so because there was this girl that I liked, and I found out that she had just done that, and she had bought this house and went and found a bunch of roommates to live with her, and those roommates paid her rent, and then she was able to pay her mortgage and then some. And I thought that's just like the best idea ever. And so I was 25, and I went and hired a real estate agent, and then bought a house in her neighborhood and just did the exact same thing. So bought this really expensive house and qualified for 100% financing back in 2005, which
Man,
is
I wish I was around in those days. I mean, I was alive, but I was like, I don't know, like 14 or something.
It was just absurd, the types of mortgages they were giving out. But that's why we had that crisis. So I was able to get this place 100% financing, and then basically move in. I took the biggest bedroom for myself. I was single, and put out a bunch of ads on Craigslist and tried to learn really quickly how to become a landlord. And so I ended up finding roommates through friends or through ads, and they would come in, look at the room that I was offering, and then we'd sign a lease. And I ended up signing 5 individual leases all within one property. So it was a 6-bedroom house. And that was interesting. So I was managing 5 leases, all with different start dates, all with different end dates, all with different rent amounts. But I did figure out, the rent based on the square footage of the room. And the idea being that that person was renting a bedroom with a closed door and a lock on it. And then all of the common areas like the living room, the bathrooms, kitchens and dining rooms, they all would share that, and they would communally keep that up and keep it clean and do their dishes and all that. So it was a really great environment for a metro area, a high density area where they were looking to start their careers. Most of the people were in their early to mid 20s, and so right out of college, and they really didn't have a lot of money, but they could afford rent on one bedroom, and that was one way to keep it really cheap. So it was a win-win. I mean, and you know, if anybody knows about multifamily housing, which is essentially what I kind of did, like I made 6 units out of one. And when you do that, you start getting into those economies of scale where you start, you know, the sum of the pieces is a whole lot more than the individual. And so I was able to charge anywhere from $750 to $1,000 for each bedroom, depending on the size. And you know, and even now I'm getting about $950 per bedroom.
Man, that's
And
6 grand. How much is your mortgage payment? Do you mind me asking? Like,
sure, yeah, let's get into the numbers. So my current mortgage payment on that house is about $4,000. That's including
what?
tax insurance. Yeah, and I make about 40 or 5,400 on that house. So I'm
Is that
netting.
after? Is that gross or is that
Well, that's after the mortgage. So
okay?
5,400 is what I bring in. 4,000 is about what I pay in the mortgage, taxes, and insurance, and then I set that $1,400 aside and you know, put some of it into a reserve fund so that I can pay for the roof and any sort of vacancy. But that house in particular has not had any vacancy ever. It's just in a great location, and because of the way it's set up, people love it. So I don't really have much vacancy there, but I do have to pay for repairs. So, you
I'm sure
know,
your property value has gone like way up too. So
yeah, when I bought it, I mean, just to be fully transparent, when I bought it in 2005, I bought it for 650, and then it just got appraised at 950. So it's not bad. I could certainly take out a home line of credit on it if I want to, but it's a good situation. So I have enough, you know, margin there to really pay for any repairs and save up a decent emergency fund for it, and then keep it rented. So
that's awesome.
it's good property. But you know, the point here is that while I'm getting $5,400 for that nice place total, I wouldn't be able to do the same thing if I had tried to rent it as a single family home that's like one unit, right? And so just based on comps and my research, I probably would only be able to get about 3,500 for that house for as a whole. If I rent it to a family that maybe a dual income family that wants to live there, I'm not opposed to it, but what I do is I just price it at like $5,000 or 5,200, and then it tends to attract the groups. So I never discriminate. I mean, obviously I'd show it to a family if they wanted to see it, but chances are the family isn't going to want to pay $5,400. But you know, I have groups of college grads banging down my door to get to it. So when I first started, I was just living there with roommates, and each of those leases, they were individual leases and relatively the same, but with different start dates and rent amounts. So that was a challenge, I would say. So as a house hack, for me, it was great because I could bring in enough money that it covered my entire mortgage back then, even, and then it paid for all of my utilities, even living there, and then I had some to spare, right?
That's
So
awesome.
that was awesome. You know, being 25, 26 years old and not having a rent payment or a house payment, you know, being able to live for free, I could certainly save up almost 100% of my salary, right? And not save 100, but you know, not have that rent payment, and then I would be able to buy another property, or I'd be able to go on fabulous vacations, and I would do those things, and it was really great. But the downside is you have 5 or 6 leases, all ending at different times. You're constantly looking for roommates, and then you have to deal with roommate drama. And you know, if somebody doesn't clean their dishes, like you're in the heart of it, right?
Well, so dive into that a little bit because how would you structure that from a community standpoint? Like, okay, dude comes in and like eats your food. Like, how do you even separate your food from your roommate's food? Like, what does that even look like?
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, I had to learn kind of as I was going through. So, what you do is, you know, similar to any other communal situation, you just designate certain spaces for certain people. So, each person has their own cabinet where they can just put any and all their food. It's a little weird when you open up the fridge and there's like 4 gallons of milk in there, and it's because everybody has their own gallon. You know, I think I lived like that for about 3 years in that house, and even though I had kind of a turning door of roommates, the same things happened over and over again. And that was that if you tried to all share the milk, right? Somebody would drink it all and then nobody would replace it. It just didn't work. So you learn that you buy your own stuff and you eat your own stuff and that's it. So if you do that type of house hack, you generally want to kind of accommodate that scenario where you try to avoid conflict. And the best ways to do that are to make sure you designate spaces. So each person gets their own cabinet or two. Put a fridge in the kitchen and then put a fridge in the basement just to make sure you have enough fridge space. Maybe get a deep freezer, and just make sure that you have enough room as if there were 6 families living there, but it's really 6 people because they're all going to buy their own stuff. So there's things like that. We did write into the lease, or I did write in the lease, all the rules. So a lot of times there's house rules and they're just sometimes posted somewhere. But in my case, I was like, I want this to be legally binding. So I put the house rules in the lease and said that everybody had to do their own dishes. Everybody had to clean up the room. Everyone had to clean up like the common areas. You can't leave your underwear out, like that kind of stuff. And I got very specific. It's very awkward, but it's way better to be specific up front and be challenged, be hard up front and then not have to deal with it on the back end.
So what do you do about pets? Like in that situation, are you just like universally no pets, or are you letting people have like 6 dogs? What does that look like?
Yeah, I would say anytime in group scenarios here, it's wise not to have any dogs or pets, cats, anything like that, because I know from my own experience that it's cats and dogs always shed. I mean, even non-shedding dogs. I have 2 golden doodles. Even non-shedding ones, there's still allergies in their saliva and whatnot. So you're bound to have one of those roommates have issues with that, and it's not their fault. They're just allergic. So, and even if you didn't have that group, if that problem wasn't in that group, you would inevitably have someone eventually who's got allergies, and then now there's cat dander in the carpets and all that. So just with so many people cycling through, it's better just to say no pets, period. And if you're attracting the types of people that really don't mind living in a community, they're probably young professionals that they probably don't have time for pets anyway. They don't have them.
Yeah, it's super interesting. So like, let's go back a little bit. I kind of drove us down a rabbit hole, but going back to kind of the finances, right? Or the numbers. So you were able through this strategy to live mortgage free. And then some. How much were you putting towards repairs? And being a young 20-year-old, was it enough? Did it bite you, or like were you solid from the get-go?
No, I wasn't very smart about that. I mean, this was my first real estate deal. I didn't quite understand, how much I really needed to do. I didn't even know what the 1% rule was when you're calculating things. And all I knew was that it was covering my mortgage, and so and then utilities. So I did save up. Well, I should say the rent that I received from that, basically, I didn't have much to spare. I mean, I was essentially comping my own living expenses because of that. So I should have been taking the excess and putting it away for repairs and then paying for my own rent with my salary. But I kind of did it backwards just because I didn't know any better. So it was all kind of mingled together in the same account. It was not smart. And I would, when the repairs would come up, I would just front the money out of my savings or out of my salary and pay for those things. And I learned a hard lesson. It was like a year after I bought it. I realized the entire back wall of the house was like sloping so that the windows were starting to like turn inwards like this. And I was like, what is happening? And I called a contractor and he ripped off some siding and he realized there was like a main support beam, a vertical beam that was rotted out and causing the back wall to collapse. So, that was a solid 10 grand to fix. And I was like, geez, this house stuff is expensive. But I was able to do it. I mean, cause I was dumping my entire salary into savings. So I was more focused on how do I build up enough for a down payment on another house. And then after that incident, I realized I needed to start dumping money into just a general emergency fund for my properties, or at the time, a single property. So that was my lesson. Now I know that I should take, as much as I can and put it into an emergency fund from the profits from each property until I have about 3 or 6 months worth of savings for that property. But and then after that, I can start using the profits to do other things. But back then I didn't know that.
That's actually a really interesting way to do it. So you don't actually like set a percentage of the income per month ongoingly. You have a certain savings range. So you said like three to 6 months. So once you hit that number, whatever that is, you're okay with just profiting 100%.
Yeah, that's the model
That's
that I
really
use.
smart. Not a lot of people talk about that. I love that.
Because I'd rather get to, let's just say, the total expenses for a property, including vacancy costs and all that stuff. Let's just say it's 2 grand, right, a month, and so I would want to have $6,000 in savings at a minimum. And the faster I can get there, then the faster I can actually start using that money for other things like buying more properties. So, and if I
Wow.
decide to only dump $100 a month into that account, then it's going to take me a long time to get to 6 grand. And what happens in like 12 months from now when I need a new roof and it costs $5,000? I'm not going to have it, right? So to get there as fast as possible. But I should preface that with saying that let's say I had 10 properties, I'm not going to have a savings account for each property with 3 months worth of expenses for that property because that's overkill. I mean, honestly, when you start to get more properties, your savings can just be bigger and you can cover potential emergencies with all the properties with that same account. So I may have 6 months of savings for the equivalent of half the properties total. I don't need to have the whole thing because not every property is going to need a roof at the same time, or not every property is going to need a new water heater at the same time.
I
So
have to tell you, man, that is such a better way to approach it. It's so much more simple. Like, it's way better. Kudos to you. I don't know if you just figured that out, but that's way smarter than everybody talking about like the 50% rule and all that because it's like, yeah, because if you have a larger portfolio, from a statistical standpoint, not all of your properties are going to need repairs at once, right? So as long as you have enough, you should be fine. Like,
right.
and it's so much easier to be like, I'm going to get to this number, and then after this number, I'm going to take all of my profit that I make from the property after taxes and mortgage expenses or whatever, and then park it into other investments or whatever I want. That's a way better lifestyle approach to it than like a hard die 50% rule. I really like that.
Thanks. The only time that's ever been an issue for me was when I go to try to qualify for other mortgages. And it's not really an issue, but it could be. So a lot of times bankers will want to know that you have 6 months. I think they actually want 6 months a lot of times of reserves for mortgage payments on every property you own. So I wouldn't be able to qualify for that just with my savings. But luckily, they do allow you to count other things like 401ks. So if you had a nice 401k set aside, even though you don't have access to it, you can't pull that money out, uh, to go do your investments. But that would count towards that 6 months. So, if you have other funds somewhere else, that will offset it. So that's why I don't really care to actually get 6 months of everything.
So going back to the way you first started, you said you had individual leases, right?
Hmm.
If you were to
Right.
redo it now, would you still structure it that way, or would you just try to do one
Yeah.
massive
Um,
massive lease? And can you do that? Is that even a
yes.
thing?
So when I finally moved out of that house and bought a studio that I could live in, I did my best to try to get off of that individual lease situation because honestly it was more drama than it was worth. I mean, you have these leases starting at different times. Like no one, when somebody moves out, they clean their bedroom maybe, and they don't bother to clean all the other stuff, and it's not a clean transition. So I think the individual lease situation isn't great. I didn't know any better when I first started, and it was difficult to like fill an empty house with five other people at the exact same time. I mean, really, they trickled in at different times. So it made sense then. And maybe if I was living in a house again, that's how I'd start again. But I would try to transition it off to a single lease as fast as possible. And what you need to do in order to make that happen is you need to have everybody be willing to sign, let's say, a year lease starting on one day and ending on another. And they all have to be ready for that. They all have to be willing to do that, and that's hard. Now, because I don't live there, whenever the place is vacant or whenever I, have a lease end, I know everybody's going to move out, and I find another group of 5 or 6 roommates who know each other usually, and they don't mind living together, and then they sign a single lease together. So they're all jointly and severally liable for the entire rent amount, which is perfect, right? That way, if four of them move out and disappear and move off to Hawaii or, go live with Brandon Turner over there, then I can still go after the other two and charge the entire rent amount to those two people. Whereas if they were individual leases, I could only pursue those two people for the rent that I promised in their single lease, which is like $800.
So I know you mentioned one property that you have now is hardly ever vacant or has never been vacant. How does that work? Do you have that as a single lease now? And is there like a super like tenant that is like kind of your manager, or what does that look like?
Yeah, that house is just in a really good location, and it makes sense for roommates. Like they look at that house and they say, "Wow, 6 bedrooms, I can live there for like $900," right? And that's awesome in the heart of DC, and it's really close to a neat, trendy area. So I think I credit that to just being a really good location. But I don't have like a house manager there. It's usually like a group of tenants that leave and then a new group come in, and I usually talk to them and say, "Hey, can someone be my main point of contact?" I'll call them the head of household, and I'll just point all issues and conversation towards them, generally speaking. But it's just not vacant because of the location, I think, and it's relatively cheap for roommates.
That's awesome.
But I do have another house where it's a similar situation. It's a 5-bedroom. It's also on Capitol Hill. And I signed a single lease with a group of tenants about 5 years ago. And those tenants have just found other tenants over the years. So when somebody has to leave and, move cities or change jobs or whatever, then they often can't terminate the whole lease because they're all on it. But one person has to leave and the other ones want to stay. What happens is they just tell that one tenant, say like, "Hey, you can leave, but just go find somebody to fill your room." And so then they do the advertising, they find somebody, and that person ends up having to pass the screening process that I instruct. So like I make them do a credit report and background check, and I kind of help with that. But at the end of the day, I just add them to the lease and remove the other guy. And so I've done that for 5 years essentially, and they've continued to just go find other roommates as they want to leave. And they love it because they can essentially break their lease or get out of their lease if they just go find somebody else who's willing to take their spot.
What?
So,
man, that's super cool. Like if you were single, that's like the best situation ever, because it's just like you and a bunch of friends get to it's literally like the sitcom Friends, It's crazy.
Yeah, it's pretty awesome. And as a landlord, like people talk about subletting being a bad thing, and I try to avoid subleases, but what I literally do is just make them assign their spot on the lease to somebody else. So that person is fully removed and not responsible going forward anymore, but the new person is, and they're okay with that because they know they can get out. And from a financial standpoint, I have a clause in my lease that says for this transaction, like in order to assign the lease or assign your name on the lease to somebody else, there's a $400 administration fee to do all that. And that includes my time. So, that'll happen 2 or 3 times a year with those 5 roommates, and I'll make an extra $1,200 just to help them do what they want to do. And they're really happy. They'll gladly pay $400 not to, to be able to move to a new city. That's easy.
So how do you do this, like being remote, like out of state? Does Cozy, is Cozy like your go-to on how to do this? Like, cause I haven't personally used Cozy, so I don't know, but is it like, can you easily like have multiple tenants on one lease and like that are revolving? Like, can you do that?
Yeah, Cozy from the start. So Cozy was founded about 4 years ago or 5 years ago now. And from the start, it went out to solve a very specific problem. Like, how do you do online rent collection with a bunch of roommates?
Oh,
and
wow.
it was just because it was founded in San Francisco, and San Francisco had a massive problem with housing, and there were lots of roommates in almost every place. And so we, from the get-go, have always intended that to be a major problem that we were solving. And so as such, Cozy handles roommates beautifully, like to the point where a landlord just has to add their email addresses for all the tenants. And then each tenant can see what the other people are paying. And they just say, I want, $900 to come out of my account and sent to the landlord at any given time. and the ledger in Cozy tracks all of that. So there's the total amount that you have to pay, the whole house has to pay, but it doesn't care if like one roommate pays $1 and the other roommate pays the rest of it, or if they split it up evenly. It gives you the flexibility to do that. And if the total rent amount is not paid by the time it's due, just like every other normal lease, there's an automatic late fee assigned according to whatever the landlord sets up.
Man, I told you guys it was the best.
It's pretty smart. And I've been using Cozy for 4 years to manage these properties. And now I live in Colorado. I don't live in DC anymore. So I manage them from 2,000 miles away. And I don't have to go visit the houses. I can do maintenance requests. I can do online rent collection and screening. I can do those subletting and those assignments all within Cozy. And I don't have to worry about it. It's easy.
That's awesome, man. You know, a couple final questions for you.
Yeah, sure.
Would this work in every market?
No.
We'll start there. Why
No.
not? Why and why not?
Because in order for people to be willing to live with a lot of roommates, that it has to be a popular, high density area. Like there has to be, housing has to be a hot commodity. And if it's not in scarcity, if it's not hard to get, then there's no need to live with people, right? I mean, I think generally speaking, as humans, why would we cram into a small room and live with other people that are going to drink our milk and eat our bread, when I don't have to?
Right.
So if I can get the same thing, the same thing as a studio or even a 1-bedroom apartment for the same price, which is totally doable in a different part of the area. Like even if you go 30 miles outside of DC, you can get a nice 1-bedroom apartment in a complex with a pool and a weight room, and you can get all that for the same price that somebody's paying for a single bedroom in Capitol Hill. So it doesn't work in all areas. But as a landlord, I think if you are a property investor, if you're looking to grow and you're looking to like maximize the units, right? So you get the most number of rent, but that concentration is not there, maybe it's not a high density area, then that's when you start looking at duplexes and triplexes and fourplexes where they're individual units, but they're still kind of under the same roof. And that's when you can really maximize the rent and kind of do the same thing, but just not a bedroom scenario.
Yeah, so that's what I was going to ask is like, what's the next question was going to be, comparing to what is most typical for the house hacking concept. How does it compare? Would you say in some ways having roommates is better, or would you say it's just really a matter of the price? Like,
Yeah.
650,000 is a lot of money, or
Right.
like, what would you do? Like, so dive into that for me.
I mean, it goes back to what you're able to do. So, and what your situation of life is. Like at the time I was a single guy starting my career, and I didn't have any family really. I was just on my own doing that. And so the idea of living with roommates was kind of neat because I could build friendships, and I could just be a good landlord that lives in and takes care of the property. And like that was attractive to me. But I think the common house hacking scenario, when people say house hacking, they think of duplexes and triplexes, and that's the most common scenario across the country. And I think the idea of living in a house with roommates is something that most people don't even consider when they're thinking about house hacking, but I think it can be more profitable. So for example, when I was looking, I ended up buying a single family home that I knew I could turn into, a 6-unit place, really a 6-bedroom place. But if I had tried to buy a fourplex, like a real fourplex in Washington, D.C. in the same area, I would have spent 4 times as much.
Right.
So those were going for $2 million, and I could get something for $650 and kind of get 6 bedrooms instead of, a fourplex. Now, I would have gotten more money for the fourplex per unit, but I don't know if the percentages probably would have been worse because I had such a big mortgage.
Yeah, and then you also have more repair costs and all of that because
Right.
you have to do it based on each unit. So, what would you do in terms of if you were to start this again, like in a highly populated area like DC, financially, like because there's no 100% mortgages now.
No.
So, how would you, if you were to start it all over in today's world? What would you do?
Well, if I was single and wasn't married, didn't have kids or dogs or anything, I would do the exact same thing from a standpoint of like I would go buy a primary residence because I know I can get 3% down mortgages or 3.5% down mortgages through FHA, or if I had some more money, I'd go, maybe get a 10% mortgage or 10% down mortgage, which are totally doable and with really great interest rates if it's my primary residence. So I would do that. I would go live in it. I would make it my primary residence. I would do repairs and renovations while I was living there and turn it into something that I could then maximize the rent. So what that would mean is I would either split it into subunits, like real subunits, which I did at another property I can talk about, or I would just make it so that there was like real communal spaces within in an individual bedrooms. And then when I would leave, I'd take off like a year or two later and I'd go find a group of roommates who wanted to live together and sign them under one lease. So essentially I'm doing the same thing again, but I'm getting that mortgage. I'm minimizing that down payment by being a primary residence. So when I did get married and living in a like house with 5 other guy roommates, like when that wasn't appealing to my wife, right? I had to figure something else out. So, and I think the other idea I had and what we ended up doing was we ended up buying a house in the suburbs of DC, still close enough to the city and still close enough to like high business areas. I bought a house that had a big basement that was, had 8-foot ceilings and designated areas and decent plumbing and bathroom, like this basement that was actually kind of a split level. And I renovated it so that the split level was cut off, shut that down and put in a side entrance and put in its own kitchen, put in its own bathroom, put in its own like AC system and thermostat. So it essentially became a 2-unit house, but still designated as a single family. And because it had its own kitchen and bathroom, like I could rent it that way. And I just made sure I was okay with the county. And what I did is I just rented the unit below where we were living. And so I made this separate 2-bedroom unit that looked really nice. And that house even had a pool, which was awesome. So I lived in the top 2 floors with my wife and my family, and then I rented out the basement in-law suite that I had kind of separated and gave its own entrance. And that unit was paying for 70% of my mortgage on the whole place. So we still had, the whole house was about 3,600 square feet, and each floor had 1,200 square feet. So I was still living in a 2,400 square foot place, and then renting out the 1,200 units below and paying for 70% of my mortgage. So it was plenty of space. It was great.
That's awesome, man.
So that's another way to house hack and still live there and buy the place as a primary residence and pay 3% down, but then cover a decent amount of your mortgage.
Do you run into any issues from like a zoning standpoint, converting a basement into a second unit, or what did you have to do with that?
Every county is different. Every county has their own rules on how to do that. So, you just have to make sure that you're not doing anything wrong or illegal or unsafe. You want to make sure there's still a window in every bedroom, so there's a way to escape a fire. Some counties don't let you have 2 stoves in a single family home because that's like the definition of a kitchen, right? Is you can have everything else. You can have sinks and dishwashers and microwaves and all that. But if you have 2 stoves, then all of a sudden you have a multifamily property. So just make sure, check with your county rules and see what they say. And yeah. And I've even seen some people where they don't have a stove. That's the defining matter. So they build an entire kitchen, but don't put a stove in. But what they do have is like little burner tops. And so it's not great if you want to bake Thanksgiving dinner for your family, but it might be great for a bunch of roommates or 2 roommates who just want to eat out all the time.
Yeah, no, that makes total sense. Well, you've given me a lot to think about because I live in Chicago, and man, like there's no way that I could ever swing this with my wife. But if I could, I could go live like in the Loop. Like I could go live downtown in the heart of everything in the most desirable area ever, and like the Gold Coast or something. And if we did this, like, with 3.5% down, I'd still have to bring probably something pretty hefty to the table, sure. Like maybe 10 to somewhere around 30,000 ish as a down payment. But man, it would be and then I'd have to do rehab, but it would be a really cool way to be like, to be in the in crowd of the city without any of the high dollar amount, you know? So I really appreciate your time. You know, thank you so much for sharing this with me. It gives me a lot to think, and I know our audience is going to love it and eat it all up. And if there was anybody that wanted to reach out to you or had any questions or wanted to connect further, what's the best place for them to go?
Yeah, sure. So you can learn a lot by going to landlordology.com. But if you want to reach out to me personally, my email is lucas@cozy.co.
Awesome. Well, thanks, man. This has been great. So yeah, that's it. And thanks so much, Lucas. We'll catch you on the next interview. Hopefully we'll get you on the show again soon. I always like picking your brain, man. So
thanks, Jaron. It's a pleasure to talk to you again.